The lights of Chicago's Gold Coast shimmered against the wide glass windows of the restaurant, their reflections spilling across polished tables and crystal glasses. Soft jazz hummed in the background, the kind that made conversations sound elegant even when they were not. Allison Grant stepped through the doorway, her posture calm, her expression composed. She wore a slate blue evening dress, simple, graceful, unpretentious, yet it drew attention in the quiet way confidence always does. She was here for a business dinner. The event was hosted by one of Michael Foster's partners, and as they entered together, the maitre d' greeted them by name. Michael, tall, composed, with the quiet assurance of someone who had nothing left to prove, placed a light hand on her back as they walked toward the reserved table near the window. Allison didn't expect to see him there, but as her gaze swept across the room, she froze for the briefest second. At a large table near the bar sat Jonathan Grant, her ex-husband. He was laughing loudly, gesturing with a half-empty glass of bourbon, surrounded by colleagues from the logistics firm that had once consumed his life. His voice still carried that easy authority that used to charm her, and for a moment the sound of it stirred something distant, more memory than feeling. A year had passed since the divorce, yet the air between them, even from across the room, seemed to thicken. Jonathan hadn't changed much. The tailored suit, the expensive watch, the exaggerated confidence, they all belonged to the man she had once tried so hard to please. But there was something different now, a kind of wear on his face that hadn't been there before. Michael followed her glance. "Someone you know?" he asked quietly. Allison allowed a small, detached smile. "Someone I used to." Jonathan turned his head at that exact moment, maybe drawn by instinct, maybe by coincidence. His laughter stopped mid-sentence. For a heartbeat. The two of them simply stared at each other. She, serene and still. He, startled, his expression flickering between disbelief and discomfort. Michael noticed, but said nothing. He pulled out Allison's chair, and she sat down smoothly, her movements unhurried, precise. Around them, conversation continued, the waitstaff gliding between tables. Yet, at Jonathan's end, the laughter had lost its rhythm. One of his friends leaned in, murmured something teasing, and Jonathan forced a grin, lifting his glass again. He hadn't expected to see her like this, composed, radiant, completely unbroken. The last time they spoke, she had been exhausted, trembling, her voice barely steady as she signed the divorce papers. He remembered her silence that day and had mistaken it for weakness. Now, as he watched her engage effortlessly with Michael, he realized it had been something else entirely, control. Allison felt his eyes on her, but refused to meet them again. She joined in the conversation at her table, discussing local art exhibits and upcoming fundraisers. Her voice was soft yet certain, the tone of a woman who no longer needed to justify her presence in any room. The waiter poured wine. Michael lifted his glass slightly toward her, and she smiled, a quiet acknowledgement between equals. Across the room, Jonathan tried to focus on his companions, but every sound seemed too sharp, the clink of cutlery, the faint echo of Allison's laugh. The woman who once orbited his world now existed beyond its reach. The realization stung more than he cared to admit. Allison, meanwhile, sat in the soft golden light, the cityscape glittering beyond the glass. For a brief second, as she lifted her glass to her lips, fragments of the past shimmered at the edge of her thoughts, the years she had spent being shaped, molded, diminished. The nights when silence had been safer than truth. The morning she had finally walked away. Michael leaned closer, his tone low. "You okay?" She nodded. "More than okay." Her words were simple, but in them lay the quiet triumph of survival. Outside, the city pulsed with life, the same city where, years earlier, a younger version of Allison had believed love could fix everything. Tonight, that belief felt like a lifetime ago. as the waiter cleared their plates. The hum of conversation faded into the background. Allison's gaze drifted once more toward the bar, not in longing but in closure. Jonathan was pretending to check his phone now, his posture stiff. She felt no satisfaction, no bitterness, only a strange, gentle distance, as if she were watching a story that no longer belonged to her. The jazz swelled softly. A cool draft from the entrance brushed against her shoulders. Somewhere deep inside, a door creaked open, the past calling to be told. And in that moment, as the laughter, the music, and the lights blurred into one, the flashback began to take shape, pulling her back to where it had all started, before the cage, before the silence, before she learned what dignity truly meant. The west side of Chicago was never quiet. Freight trains rumbled in the distance. Buses sighed at every stop, and the wind carried the smell of old brick and iron. In a narrow two-bedroom apartment above a corner grocery, Allison Grant grew up with her mother, Margaret Hayes, a woman whose voice was both soft and steady, like the ticking of a clock that never stopped, no matter how hard life tried to break it. Her father had left when she was 3. There were no arguments she could remember, no final words, only the faint image of a man walking down the hallway, a suitcase brushing the doorframe. From then on, it was just the two of them, Margaret and her little girl, surviving on a teacher's salary and the quiet conviction that love could fill the space money couldn't. Their apartment was small but spotless. The kitchen always smelled of something simmering, soup in winter, stew in fall, and the window above the sink was lined with small plants that Allison insisted on naming. On Fridays, Margaret would sit grading papers while Allison drew stories in her notebooks, inventing characters who traveled to faraway places she couldn't yet pronounce. Margaret never complained about the long days at the elementary school where she taught. She would come home, take off her coat, and smile at Allison like the world outside had never worn her down. "We can't control how much we have," she would say, "but we can control how we treat people and how we carry ourselves when no one's watching." Those words settled deep inside Allison, shaping her in ways she didn't understand until much later. Books became her refuge. By 12, she was already reading short novels in French from the public library, tracing each word with her finger as if it might unlock another life. Spanish followed soon after. Then a fascination with how words could build bridges between people who'd never met. Margaret noticed early on and encouraged it. "If language is your gift," she told her, "then let it take you somewhere my feet never could." Every morning before school, they walked together to the bus stop, their hands wrapped around cheap coffee cups from the corner store. Allison would watch her mother greet neighbors, always with the same calm politeness that carried dignity even in a worn winter coat. That, more than any lesson from school, taught her what strength looked like: quiet, consistent, never needing to announce itself. By high school, Allison's grades drew the attention of her teachers. She won a district essay contest, then a language award, then a scholarship interview at the University of Illinois. The day the acceptance letter arrived, Margaret held it as if it were made of glass. "You did it," she whispered. But Allison shook her head gently. "We did." When she left for college, the neighborhood seemed smaller than she remembered, the faded signs, the cracked sidewalks, the place that had been both her comfort and her cage. She promised herself she'd come back one day, not to stay, but to lift her mother out of there, to buy her the quiet home she deserved, with wide windows and sunlight instead of noise and smoke. On the train ride to Champaign, she looked out at the skyline fading behind her and thought of all the words her mother had taught her: patience, integrity, resilience. At that moment, she believed those would be enough to build the kind of life both of them had dreamed of. She didn't yet know that the very strength she learned in that small apartment would be tested in ways she couldn't imagine. For now, the future looked open, bright, and possible. Allison carried her mother's lessons like a secret armor, unaware that someday they would be all that kept her standing. The first autumn at the University of Illinois changed everything for Allison Grant. She had never been away from home before, never known what silence sounded like without the hum of trains outside her window. The campus was sprawling, golden with fallen leaves, filled with voices from every corner of the world. She loved it immediately, the books, the challenge, the freedom. In her second semester, she enrolled in an advanced linguistics class taught by Professor Leonard Evans, a man in his 50s with an unhurried way of speaking and a mind like a compass. While others treated the subject as theory, Allison saw language as a living thing. Her essays were precise, her translations full of emotional nuance. After class one day, Evans stopped her on the way out. "You hear tone and rhythm like a musician," he said. "That's rare, Ms. Grant. Don't lose that." He became the mentor she hadn't known she needed. Evans saw the discipline behind her curiosity, the way she stayed after lectures to ask questions, or how she translated whole chapters just for practice. He pushed her toward international programs, helped her secure an internship with a travel company that worked with European clients, and recommended her for a small translation project that became her first paid job. Every check she earned, Allison sent part of it home. Margaret protested at first, but Allison insisted. "You paid for everything else. Let me do this." She bought her mother a new winter coat, then paid off an old utility debt that had followed them for years. It wasn't much, but it felt like reclaiming something that life had owed them. For the first time, Allison allowed herself to imagine stability. She rented a tiny apartment near campus, just big enough for a desk, a bed, and a stack of dictionaries that grew taller each semester. She filled the walls with postcards of cities she hoped to see one day: Paris, Madrid, Lisbon. Every night, as she studied under the hum of a desk lamp, she thought of her mother's voice saying, "If language is your gift, let it take you somewhere my feet never could." Evans often reminded her that intellect without integrity meant nothing. He treated her not as a student to impress, but as an equal in training. When she doubted herself, he would only smile and say, "Your work will speak long after you do, Allison. Just give it time." Those words stayed with her through every late-night translation and every quiet victory. By her final year, she had built a reputation as one of the most promising graduates in the department. Professors sought her input on projects. Classmates turned to her for guidance. She graduated with honors, holding the diploma like proof that everything her mother had endured had been worth it. The summer after graduation, the travel company that once gave her an internship offered her a full-time position. She accepted without hesitation. It felt like the beginning of something solid, something earned. Allison was 24, young, hopeful, self-sufficient. She rented a small studio overlooking the Chicago River and decorated it with second-hand furniture, fresh flowers, and the scent of new beginnings. On weekends, she and her mother would visit the art museum, their laughter echoing down marble halls. For the first time in her life, Allison believed she had built a foundation strong enough to last. She had a career she loved, a mentor who believed in her, and a quiet pride that came from standing on her own 2 feet. She didn't know that life, in its cruel symmetry, was already preparing to test everything she had built, because soon a man named Jonathan Grant would walk into her world, and nothing would ever be the same again. Allison first met Jonathan Grant on an ordinary Monday morning, the kind where the city moved with mechanical precision, coffee lines, traffic lights, briefcases clutched against the wind. He walked into the travel agency, where she worked with the confidence of someone who believed the world would rearrange itself to make room for him. He was tall, impeccably dressed in a charcoal suit, and carried the quiet authority of a man accustomed to getting his way. As a branch director at a Chicago energy firm, Jonathan had come to negotiate a corporate travel contract for his employees. When Allison approached to assist, his attention sharpened. Their conversation was professional at first, dates, logistics, pricing, but his tone held a kind of deliberate charm. "You remind me of someone who makes the world softer just by standing in it," he said lightly, as if it were a casual observation rather than the spark of something calculated. The words caught her off guard. No one had ever spoken to her like that, gently, admiringly, as though she were something rare. Allison laughed it off, but that night, as she closed her laptop and watched the Chicago lights flicker beyond her apartment window, the echo of his voice lingered. Jonathan called the next morning with follow-up questions that didn't really need answering. He sent an email later, thanking her for her exceptional professionalism and suggesting coffee to discuss future collaboration. Their meetings grew less about business and more about conversations. That stretched long after the cups were empty. He seemed perfect, successful, attentive, confident without arrogance. He remembered details she didn't expect him to: the name of her mother, her favorite cafe, the languages she spoke. When she mentioned her dreams of visiting Europe, he smiled. "Then one day, I'll take you there myself," he promised. For someone like Allison, who had spent her life measuring worth through effort, Jonathan's effortless certainty felt intoxicating. He made decisions quickly, solved problems with money or authority, and spoke of their future as if it were inevitable. He began to send flowers to her office, simple notes attached. "You deserve more than ordinary." When he picked her up from work, he opened car doors, carried her bag, paid for every meal. At first, she saw it as kindness. Later, as he began to choose the restaurants, the wine, even the color of her dresses, she told herself it was care, his way of protecting her from indecision. Allison's mother, Margaret, noticed the change. "He's charming," she said carefully, "but sometimes charm hides the need to control." Allison brushed it off. "He's just confident, Mom. He wants what's best for us." Within 6 months, Jonathan proposed. The evening was dazzling: white tablecloths, candlelight, and a private corner at a restaurant overlooking the Chicago River. A pianist played softly while the city glowed beyond the windows. Jonathan knelt with a velvet box in hand, and the world seemed to still. "Allison Grant," he said, his voice smooth and deliberate, "you make me want to be better than I am. Will you marry me?" The room blurred in her tears. She nodded, too overwhelmed to speak. Around them, other diners clapped, waiters smiled, and the pianist shifted to a tender melody. It was the kind of moment she had only seen in films, the fairy tale she never thought belonged to her. That night, as Jonathan wrapped his coat around her shoulders and led her out into the winter air, she believed she had found the man who would cherish her forever. The city lights reflected on the river like shards of gold, and she thought life had finally rewarded her for all the years of struggle. She didn't yet know that what seemed like devotion was only possession disguised as love, and that the same hands now holding her so gently would one day be the ones to take her freedom away. After the wedding, Allison moved into Jonathan's apartment in downtown Chicago, a pristine corner unit overlooking the river, all glass and steel and quiet perfection. The first week felt like stepping into a different life. Sleek furniture, fresh flowers delivered every Friday, a balcony where the skyline glittered like something out of a movie. She thought it was love. It felt like success. Jonathan's world was orderly, efficient, and controlled. At first, Allison admired that. He woke at 5:30, worked out, answered emails before sunrise, and expected life to follow the same schedule. He liked precision in everything, from the way the pillows were arranged to the number of wine glasses left on the table. "Structure keeps us civilized," he said once, smiling. Gradually, that structure expanded to include her. He started with small things: the way she styled her hair, the shade of lipstick he thought looked too loud. Then it became which friends she should keep, which ones didn't fit this new chapter. When she wanted to invite her old co-workers for lunch, he frowned. You don't need to surround yourself with small minds anymore. You're my wife now. That means something. Allison told herself it was love, that he just wanted her life to be easier, neater, safer. She gave up the apartment she'd once rented near the river, left her job at the travel company, and started spending her days managing their home. He encouraged it, praising her cooking, her elegance, her devotion. "You make us look good," he'd say, like she was an accessory chosen with care. Her friends stopped calling as often. At first, she missed the chatter, the laughter that used to fill her evenings. But Jonathan's approval meant more than their messages. She convinced herself she was becoming the kind of woman he deserved. Calm, graceful, predictable. When Margaret visited the new apartment for the first time, she sensed something different in her daughter. The place was beautiful, but sterile, like a museum where everything was allowed to shine except the person living in it. Margaret tried to keep her voice gentle. "He seems to love control more than love itself," she said softly as they washed dishes together. Allison's smile was tight. "You're overthinking, Mom. He just wants things done right." That night, after her mother left, Jonathan asked what they'd talked about. When she told him, he laughed, not kindly. "You really shouldn't let her meddle in our marriage. She's from another world." Over time, the laughter stopped. Jonathan became distant, cold in a way that didn't involve shouting, but silence. He didn't argue, he dismissed. If Allison mentioned feeling lonely, he responded with a list of her privileges. "You live in one of the most expensive buildings in the city, Allison. What more do you need?" The marriage that had begun with affection turned into something airless. She moved through each day like part of the decor, smiling when spoken to, beautiful when expected, quiet when not. The city outside their windows kept pulsing with energy. But inside, everything was still. Sometimes she caught her reflection in the glass. Elegant, composed, unfamiliar. She'd barely recognized the woman who had once filled rooms with laughter and purpose. The woman who had studied languages and dreamed of independence was gone, replaced by someone who measured her worth in how smoothly she could disappear into Jonathan's world. And yet, somewhere deep beneath the surface, something of her remained. It was faint, almost invisible, but it waited, like a breath held too long, aching to be released. 2 months after the wedding, Allison discovered she was pregnant. She had expected joy, the kind that fills a home with laughter and plans. But Jonathan's reaction was a polite nod, not the warmth she imagined. "Good," he said, already scanning an email on his phone. That was fast. At first, she convinced herself that he was simply overwhelmed. She spoke of nursery colors, baby names, and schedules. But Jonathan always found a reason to change the subject. His affection cooled, his patience shorter than ever. He began to correct her more often. How she spoke, how she sat, how she let herself go. When she grew tired, he rolled his eyes. "Other women handle pregnancy without turning it into a full-time drama," he said. "You're stronger than this, Allison, or at least I thought you were." The word stung more than she admitted. She had always prided herself on resilience, on being capable and composed. Now, she was too exhausted to fight back. The nausea, the endless appointments, the weight of carrying life inside her, it all blurred together into quiet endurance. Her doctor confirmed she was expecting twins. The nurse smiled, handing her the sonogram picture. 2 tiny shapes, fragile and miraculous. That evening, she waited for Jonathan to come home early so she could share the news. He arrived late, loosening his tie as he poured himself a drink. "Jonathan," she said softly, holding out the image. "It's twins, a boy and a girl." He looked at it for less than a second before asking, "At least one of them's a boy, right?" The sentence landed like a blow, casual, cruel, final. He set the glass down, kissed her forehead mechanically, and went to shower. Allison stood alone in the living room, the sonogram trembling in her hands. The city lights flickered through the windows, indifferent to her breaking heart. From that moment, something inside her shifted. The illusion of the perfect husband began to crumble, piece by piece. Jonathan became impatient, distant, always busy. He avoided her doctor's visits, claiming important meetings, and dismissed every attempt at conversation. When Margaret visited to help her prepare for the birth, she saw the truth in her daughter's eyes. "He's not cruel in words," she told Allison quietly one afternoon, "but he's cruel in absence. That's worse." Allison smiled weakly, unwilling to burden her mother. "He'll come around once the babies are here." But he didn't. The night her labor began, a blizzard swept across the city. She called Jonathan first, but his assistant answered he was in Houston for a last-minute presentation. Her next call was to her mother. Margaret arrived within the hour, her coat still dusted with snow. The drive to the hospital was long and silent, broken only by Allison's short, sharp breaths. In the delivery room, the pain came like waves, unrelenting and raw. She reached for a hand that wasn't there, and it was Margaret's that held hers through every contraction, every cry. When the twins were born, a boy and a girl, healthy and small, Allison wept not only from relief, but from the ache of realizing Jonathan hadn't even tried to be there. The nurse asked if she wanted to call him. Allison shook her head. Not tonight. Hours later, the room was quiet except for the soft breathing of her children and the hum of hospital machines. Margaret sat beside her, stroking her hair gently. "You're not alone," her mother whispered. Allison looked at her newborns, their tiny hands curled into fists, and knew she was right. Jonathan's absence no longer hurt in the same way. It clarified. It showed her exactly what kind of love she was no longer willing to beg for. The years after Ethan and Sophie were born blurred into routine, a rhythm of feedings, diapers, school runs, and sleepless nights. What should have been a season of joy slowly hardened into something cold and predictable. Jonathan's absence became the rule, not the exception. He left before sunrise, came home after midnight, and spent weekends catching up on work. At first, Allison made excuses for him. She told herself he was building their future, providing for the family, doing what good husbands did. But as the months turned into years, she stopped believing her own words. The apartment remained immaculate, the meals perfectly timed, the twins well-behaved. Jonathan liked order, and Allison delivered it at the cost of herself. The woman who once translated languages and dreamed of the world now spoke only in the phrases of domestic life. "Dinner's ready. They've brushed their teeth. Good night." Jonathan's interest in the children was transactional. He liked parading them in front of guests, miniatures of his success. But when they cried, or when Sophie woke from nightmares, he would sigh, frustrated. "You need to teach them discipline, Allison. Don't let them grow soft." She said nothing, only nodded. Her silence had become habit, her smiles rehearsed. Her world grew smaller with every passing year. She rarely saw her college friends. They stopped inviting her after the third. Maybe next time. Even her mentor, Professor Evans, had retired and moved away. The only constant connection she had was with her mother. Margaret visited whenever she could, her presence a rare light in Allison's dimming days. They'd sit at the kitchen table while the twins played in the living room. Margaret would talk about her students, her books, the small joys she still found in life. But lately, she looked more fragile, her movements slower, her face paler. The diagnosis came quietly. Her heart condition had returned. Allison accompanied her to the hospital, juggling appointments between school pickups and meals. She tried to stay strong, but exhaustion crept into every corner of her life. Jonathan noticed only to complain. "You look tired," he said once. "You should rest more. The kids don't need a mother who looks worn out." It wasn't concern. It was criticism disguised as advice. The apartment that once felt luxurious now resembled a cage lined with polished walls and expensive emptiness. Allison stopped dressing up, stopped playing music, stopped caring about dinner parties. The city outside still pulsed with ambition and noise, but from her window it all looked distant, unreachable. At night, after the twins were asleep, she would sit by the window and watch the trains snake across the river bridges. She wondered what kind of woman she might have become if she'd taken a different path, if she'd kept working, kept dreaming. Sometimes she imagined a parallel life, one where she translated books, traveled abroad, met people who valued her for her mind, not her silence. But those thoughts faded with the dawn. There were lunches to pack, errands to run, bills to manage. One evening, while folding laundry, Allison looked up at her reflection in the darkened window. For a moment, she didn't recognize herself. The woman staring back seemed hollow, efficient, and perfectly invisible. She realized then that she had been slowly erased, first from Jonathan's world, then from her own. The awareness didn't come with anger or tears, only a quiet ache, a kind of mourning for a person she once was. She thought of her mother's warning years ago. He seems to love control more than love itself. Margaret had been right. The next morning, Allison woke before everyone else. The house still, dark, and silent. She stood in the kitchen, hands wrapped around a mug of coffee gone cold, and whispered to herself, "This can't be all there is!" The words hung in the air, faint but alive. For the first time in years, they didn't feel like surrender. They felt like the beginning of something trying to wake. When Ethan and Sophie started kindergarten, Allison felt a small window of freedom reopen, a sliver of the life she once had. The twins were old enough for school. Her mother's health had stabilized for the moment, and the quiet hours between morning drop-off and afternoon pickup whispered possibility. She decided to reach out to her old employer at the travel agency. The building hadn't changed much. Same polished floors, same hum of printers and voices. When her former manager saw her, his face lit up. "We've missed you, Allison. How about a part-time position? Mornings only." The offer wasn't glamorous, but it felt like breathing again. She accepted immediately. When she told Jonathan, his reaction was swift and cold. "A job? For what?" She hesitated. "For myself, Jonathan. I just want to feel useful again." He laughed under his breath. "No wife of mine needs to work." The phrase struck harder than any insult. She tried to reason with him, explained it wouldn't affect her duties at home, that it was only a few hours a day. But every word seemed to make him angrier. "I'm providing everything you could possibly need," he said. "Do you think cleaning offices for tourists makes you important?" "It's not about importance," she replied quietly. "It's about feeling human." Jonathan's expression hardened. "You have everything a woman could want, and yet you're still not satisfied. Maybe the problem isn't your life, Allison. Maybe it's you." The conversation ended with slammed doors and silence. Still, she took the job. Each morning she packed lunches, walked the twins to school, then rode the train downtown. For a few hours each day, she was herself again, competent, surrounded by people who remembered her as something other than Jonathan's wife. She helped coordinate conferences, booked corporate trips, and even reconnected with an old colleague who admired her resilience. But the freedom was fragile. Jonathan's disapproval seeped into every corner of her life. He began to forget to deposit the household allowance, forcing her to dip into her small paycheck to cover groceries. He complained about dinners being late, about the house not being spotless. "You wanted to play career woman," he sneered one night. "Then don't expect me to pick up the slack." Allison said nothing. She had learned that arguing only made the walls close in tighter. Then came the night everything changed. She returned home early one evening. Her shift cut short because of a power outage at the office. Jonathan's car was in the garage, though he had told her he'd be at a business dinner. She set her bag down, noticing the faint sound of laughter from his study. Curiosity, or maybe instinct, drew her closer. Through the cracked door, she heard his voice. "No, baby. She doesn't suspect a thing. She's too busy pretending to be important at that stupid travel agency." The woman on the other end giggled. Jonathan chuckled softly. "You're different, Rachel. You know how to keep things interesting." Allison's stomach clenched. She stepped back quietly, her pulse hammering in her ears. The house felt colder, emptier, even as his voice filled it. That night, when Jonathan emerged from his study, she confronted him. "Who is she?" He stared at her for a moment, then smiled a sharp, dismissive smile. "Don't start, Allison. You've been neglecting everything here. What did you expect?" When she didn't respond, he stepped closer, his voice low and venomous. "You forgot your place, Allison." Something in her broke, not loudly but completely. She didn't scream, didn't cry. She simply looked at him as if seeing him for the first time. The man who once held her hand through candlelight dinners now stood before her, small and cruel beneath his expensive suit. Jonathan stormed out, slamming the door. The echo lingered long after he was gone. That night, Allison sat alone in the dark, her phone cold in her hand, listening to the twins breathing softly down the hall. Her heart no longer ached. It felt emptied, scraped clean of hope. And somewhere in that silence, a single truth formed, clear, steady, undeniable. She was done. Allison left the apartment on a gray morning, taking nothing more than her clothes, her laptop, and a stack of children's drawings. The silence in Jonathan's condo followed her out the door, heavy but final. She drove to her mother's small house on the edge of Oak Park, where Margaret greeted her with tired eyes and open arms. The house smelled like chamomile tea and old books. There, life moved at a gentler pace. Allison turned one of the spare rooms into a workspace, setting up a modest desk by the window. With a borrowed microphone and an aging laptop, she began teaching Spanish lessons online. It wasn't glamorous, but it was hers. Between classes, she took freelance translation projects, finding comfort in the steady rhythm of words. Each sentence she translated reminded her of who she used to be, someone capable, patient, alive. Margaret's health, though, was fading. Her heart condition had grown worse, and despite medication, her strength waned by the week. Allison took care of her the way her mother once cared for her, making soups, driving her to appointments, holding her hand during long afternoons of silence. One night, Margaret called her to the bedside. "You've always been kind," she whispered, her voice faint but clear. "But don't let kindness be your prison." Those were the last words Allison ever heard her mother say. Margaret passed away peacefully a few days later, leaving behind a note folded neatly inside her favorite book. The handwriting trembled, but remained unmistakably hers. "Don't live small to make others comfortable. Don't let kindness be your prison." Allison held the letter to her chest, tears blurring the ink. It wasn't just advice, it was permission to start over. In the months that followed, grief and purpose became her companions. She worked late into the night, took certification exams to regain her professional credentials, and reached out to old contacts in the language community. Through a mutual acquaintance, she learned that Professor Leonard Evans, now retired, was seeking a consultant for a nonprofit translation project assisting immigrant families. Their reunion was quiet but full of unspoken warmth. "I always knew you'd come back to this," he said, shaking her hand. "Some talents don't fade, they just wait." Working alongside Evans reignited something inside her. The work was demanding yet meaningful, the kind that didn't just pay bills but restored dignity. She began to smile again, Not the practiced smile of survival, but the real one, soft, tired human. It was through one of these community events that she met Michael Foster again. He had been a client from her travel agency years ago, now managing a financial consulting firm. Time had mellowed him. His kindness carried no agenda, his questions no judgment. They spoke easily about work, books, life's unpredictable turns. Michael admired her calm strength. Allison appreciated his quiet steadiness. Their connection unfolded naturally without urgency. He didn't ask about Jonathan, and she didn't offer. What mattered was the present, the shared laughter over coffee, the comfort of conversation without pretense. By the following spring, Allison had found balance again. Her days were simple but full. Mornings teaching online, afternoons translating. Evenings spent walking through the quiet streets of Oak Park. She planted flowers in her mother's old garden, watched the twins play in the sunlight, and felt, for the first time in years, that life belonged to her again. The woman who once lived under someone else's control now woke each day guided only by her own choices. There was still grief, still memory, but they no longer ruled her. Allison wasn't chasing perfection anymore. She was simply living, and that finally was enough. The restaurant glittered with candlelight, the hum of laughter blending with soft piano notes. It was the same place where Allison had once stood on the edge of heartbreak, and now she returned not as a ghost from the past, but as someone entirely reborn. At a long table near the center, Jonathan Grant held court. He looked exactly as she remembered. Immaculate suit, watch gleaming, smile rehearsed. A crowd of colleagues and clients surrounded him, their laughter loud and eager. Beside him sat a young woman, elegant, polished, the new, perfect companion. Jonathan raised his glass, tapping it gently for attention. "To progress," he said, his voice carrying easily across the room. "To the company we built, and to the people who make success look effortless. And, of course," he added with a smirk, resting a hand on the woman's shoulder, "to the kind of partnership that inspires everything I do." The table erupted in polite applause. Jonathan basked in it, proud, certain, until his gaze lifted and froze. Across the room, Allison had just entered, her hand resting lightly on Michael Foster's arm. She looked poised, radiant in a navy silk dress. Her hair swept back, her expression calm. There was no hint of the woman he once tried to mold. This Allison carried her own gravity, self-contained, untouchable. Jonathan's voice faltered mid-sentence. For a moment he couldn't speak. His new companion glanced at him, confused. Michael guided Allison toward a table nearby, nodding politely to the waiter. He said something that made her laugh, a quiet, genuine sound that cut through the background music. Heads turned, and whispers rippled softly through the crowd. Jonathan tried to recover. He forced a grin and lifted his glass again, but the confidence in his voice was gone. To new beginnings," he finished weakly. Allison met his eyes only once. It wasn't a challenge or a victory, just acknowledgement, a silent closing of a chapter. Then she turned her attention back to Michael, completely unbothered. A few of Jonathan's colleagues recognized her. One leaned in, whispering, "Isn't that your ex-wife?" Jonathan's jaw tightened. "It's complicated," he muttered, but the room had already shifted. The charm he'd worn like armor was cracking under the weight of what stood before him. The evening moved on, but not for Jonathan. His laughter came forced. His glass stayed too full. Meanwhile, Allison seemed untouched by it all. She conversed easily with the couple beside her, her composure steady, her warmth genuine. When the waiter arrived with champagne, Michael lifted his glass toward her. "To people who rebuild themselves from the ruins," he said softly, his voice carrying just enough for those nearby to hear, "and make it look like grace." Allison's smile was small but real. The toast was for her. Yet it wasn't about revenge, it was about recognition. About the quiet power of surviving without bitterness. Jonathan's glass trembled slightly as he drank. The man who once prided himself on control could do nothing but watch as the woman he dismissed as weak now embodied everything he had lost, and everything he would never touch again. When dinner ended, Allison stood, thanked the hosts, and walked toward the exit. Outside, the night was cool and bright, the city humming softly beneath her heels. A breeze lifted her hair, carrying with it the faint scent of spring and freedom. Michael offered her his coat, but she shook her head with a quiet smile. "I'm fine," she said. As they stepped onto the sidewalk, the lights of Chicago shimmered across the river, reflected like scattered stars. Allison paused for a moment, looking out at the city that had once held her captive. There was no anger left, no desire to prove anything. The silence between them was peaceful. She didn't need to look back. She didn't need an apology. She didn't need revenge. Dignity itself was her revenge.